DNS is an acronym you should get used to as an IT professional. Domain name system, but what is it for? Find out more next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to IT Pro TV's A+ show. We are diving into, well, DNS, and that will not be the only acronym we'll use in the entire show, but for today, that's what we're going to be taking a look at. And here to explain the mysteries of it, well, Mr. Wes Bryan.
Hey, Roddy, thanks for having me. That's right, we're going to be looking at DNS, and that's the domain name system. And it's one of the most important services that we have within our networks today. We use it on our internal networks, we use it across the internet. It's one of the things that makes it a little bit easier to find some of those resources. So that's what we're going to be looking at, identifying some of the components within DNS as well as explaining its purpose here in this episode.
All right, a lot to cover. Why don't we head on over to the bench?
All right, everyone, come on and join us. We're going to go ahead here and we'll talk a little bit about DNS. And one of the important things that I want you to know about domain name system is that it provides a service called name resolution. Name resolution is important because I want you to think when you came to the ACI webpage or the IT Pro TV site, did you type in an IP address? Because that's what the computers use in order to communicate. They use IPv4 and IPv6 addresses. They don't use names. But for us, humans, it's easier to remember a name than it is a 4-octet IP address. And we don't want to have to type that in every time we want to visit a website or we want to visit a location on the internet. So what do? We type in things like www.itpro.tv, and when we hit enter, it connects. Right? How is it that the web browser, when I click that link, knows the IP address? That's where name resolution comes in. I want you to understand that name resolution for domain name system is the process of mapping what's known as a fully qualified domain name, or an FQDN, to an IP address. That's the name resolution part, and that's one of the most important things when we look at this service today.
Yeah, when it comes down to this, right, it really is just making networks humanly accessible, right?
Right.
So that we don't have to remember all these strings of numbers here. But where does it begin? How do we actually know what to type into like a browser?
So that's where that concept of a FQDN comes in. Now, the FQDN, what is the FQDN? Well, that is a fully qualified domain name. But what does it qualify it as being fully qualified, right? Well, it's the components that make up an FQDN that we want you to be able to identify so that generically, when you are done with this, you know what an FQDN is and you know that the domain name system helps us to find the IP addresses associated with those FQDNs. Let me show you what I mean here. So I've got a domain controller that, believe it or not, is also running a DNS service here. So it's also a DNS server. We'll focus on the DNS server part here in a second, but what I want to look at is what makes up a fully qualified domain name. Well, a fully qualified domain name is a combination of what's known as a host name and a domain name. So for us here in our A+ demo lab that we've been using, my computer name is my host name, and that is DC01. The domain name, if you will, is a+demo.local. Now that last part of that name, I have .local. We use that if we don't want to have any external resolution, just in demos, right? But I want you to think about that last part. That last part, .local here. Let's change that to something like .com, right? When we talk about .com, that is the farthest right portion of what's known as the DNS namespace. The .com, if you will, are DNS servers out there that are responsible for locating records within the .com domain namespace, tv.org.edu. The next part of this domain name is typically the company or the organization that has basically leased the portion of that namespace. And then finally we have what's known as the host. And the host is typically owned and controlled by the company whose portion of that DNS namespace we see here. So in my case, I have a DNS demo domain. And again, the full domain name would be .local, and I am in control of DC01. So a fully qualified domain name is a combination of a host name and a domain name. And remember that the name resolution part is mapping this name to its IP address. So if I look down here and I look at my properties of our network adapter, I can see that we have this IP address. Name resolution would say that if I needed to find this computer, I could use DNS and type just the fully qualified domain name, and DNS would help map it to its IP address so that I could make a connection. And that's one of the important takeaways. If you've never seen DNS, very basically, user-friendly names mapped to their IP addresses through a process known as name resolution.
Now, with that in mind, let's talk about that process a little bit. How does a computer get that idea of where that name is actually matched to a particular IP address? How do they actually begin that process?
Well, that's great. So if we look here, what's going to happen? You're going to look a couple of places, right? So when your computer, keep in mind it's the software that's generating this, hey, where is that IP address? I've got this name. So what happens is your computer, locally, it's going to say, I need to find, let's say, file server 01.acilearning.com. Where do I find it? All right. What it's going to do is it's actually going to look locally first in a file on your local computer. It's called the host file. And in the earlier days, this is how we would we would have to fill up these files with these mappings. The file's there today, but we don't use it because we utilize the benefits of DNS. So it looks there and it says, I don't find anything. The other thing about DNS is if I've already asked you or the DNS server where that IP address is and it's responded back to me, I just kind of keep a record of it. I just write it down locally. And if I need to find that IP address again related to that fully qualified domain name, my computer says, all right, I got a record over here. I've already got an answer. I go ahead and connect, and that process is done. But let's say the process isn't done, right? Let's say we don't have that locally. What's going to happen? Well, if you look, let's right-click on the properties of our network adapter again, and let's take a look at our a network adapter specifically. All right, so on our network adapter, if I look at the status, all right, and we choose details here, my computer is configured with a DNS server, all right? We've looked at the host file, it's empty, doesn't contain anything, we don't use it. We looked to see if we'd already had an answer before in something known as the local resolver cache, and when we don't find that, it says, all right, well, let me look to the IP address of the DNS server that's configured. All right, now this could be an internal DNS server if you're an enterprise network. If you're on a home network watching from home, it's typically your ISP. Ask that DNS server where you can find the information. And then the DNS server does something kind of interesting. It goes through a process of asking other DNS servers across the internet, where is the IP address of this host? Where is it? And it talks to the .com server first, all right? That higher part of the hierarchy. And the .com server says, I don't know where this host is, DC01. I tell you what, I am looking right here, and I've got a record for A+ demo. Go talk to that domain owner. They might have your answer for you. And then I go talk to that domain owner's DNS server, and it says, yeah, I know who DC01 is. DC01 you can find here at 10.0.12.46. Returns that back to my local machine, and my machine makes the connection. That's the name resolution process, and something I would be able to identify and how it works, not only to support it, but also to do things like troubleshooting DNS too.
Now, with that on an individual computer, that actually sounds pretty neat that the computer itself can reach out and even get all that stuff across the internet. But what about for a network itself in terms of like an enterprise network? How do we actually get all this information so that everybody can use it at the same time?
Oh, that's a good question, Ronnie. The way that happens is you typically will have, like for an enterprise network, we'll have an internal, what we call private DNS server. That's one that's just there for the company. It's gonna help us to find things within your organization. That DNS server has a database. The database contains a variety of records. There are just a couple of these records that I want you to be able to know, because when I say it resolves that FQDN to an IP address, how it's doing that is that question of the DNS server, where do I find it? It looks at a record. Let me show you what I mean here. I've actually got the DNS database, the DNS server console open, and if we expand out our folder here for forward lookup zones, more specifically, here are, I should say, those records. And there's a few different records I want you to be able to identify. Host records are sometimes called A records or address records. Those records map a host name to an IPv4 address. And when your computer says, hey, A+ demo, where is DCO1? That DNS server for A+ demo looks and says, oh yeah, I can see it. You can find DCO1 here at 10.0.12.46. And that is part of that database. But I will tell you, there are a variety of other records that we can configure. All right? I want you to know that there is a way, and there's a new host name, there is what is known as a PTR record, which kind of does the reverse. It takes an IP address and maps it to a fully qualified domain name. You also have these, what are known as quad A records, all right? What's the difference between an A host record and, well, 4 A's, quad A? Well, quad A actually takes a host name, and a host, if you will, and resolves it to IPv6. So A records, host names to IPv4, quad A records, host names to IPv6. The other one I want you to know is the MX record. That one is a mail exchanger record, and that's a way to say, hey, who at A+ demo should be the one that is allowed to send email on that domain's behalf? Well, there's your mail exchanger record. These are very, very important records to be able to know, to be able to identify, I should say. The one that I mentioned there, PTR, that one's a little tricky because that one reverses that lookup. Maybe you've got an IP address and you say, where's the name? So we also have the ability to do that. Those are important ones. The final ones that I'm going to mention are just briefly is what's known as a TXT record. All right, there are other types of records, and you can see there are a whole bunch of them here. I'm not worried about all of these, and you shouldn't be on the exam or in a support role if you're in help desk, but I would be aware of the TXT record, especially if you're in a certification endeavor. TXT records are plain text records, but we have the ability to use them to our advantage through things like spam management. There are 3 types of records that I'm just going to briefly mention here, and it's really the only bit that you would need to know for a certification exam. There's something known as the Domain Keys Identified Mail, DKIM. There's also another one called Sender Policy Framework, SPF, and finally one that's known as DMARC, which is the Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting Conformance. We're not without acronyms. Here's what I want you to know about DKIM, SPF, and DMARC, and really nothing more. They allow us to protect our domain from sending spam. They allow us to put a little bit of security on those responses that come back so that you can verify if you just ask where you can find DCO1 in my A+ demo domain, when I respond back to you, you know it came from me. So just think about it as a way that we can use text records to secure, to provide a little bit of security and prevent things like spam. This is the DNS infrastructure, and it's something that's very important for you to be able to identify and be able to troubleshoot certification or support endeavors. It's one of the most important services that we have that allows us to find resources on the internet, and the more you know about it, the better you're going to do in your career.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.